Welcome to Last Words on the Pit. I'm Zeena Koda, and today we're talking about something super interesting, an area I'm pretty keen on, the connection between hip hop and metal, especially right now.
I'm Katy Irizarry from Season of Miss, Loudwire, and Outburn.
And I am Doc Coyle from the band Bad Wolves and host of the X-Men podcast.
I know that we all come from areas where hip hop and metal have always kind of been intrinsically connected, right? What are your thoughts on this new crop of hip hop metal fusions, and is this something that's existed for a long time?
Being born in 1989, this is kind of the metal that I grew up on. When I first was a young burgeoning metalhead in, the 7th, 8th grade, the bands that were popular were Linkin Park and Korn and Rage Against the Machine and the Beastie Boys. So this was all already kind of a big part of me coming up as a metalhead and a part of my DNA.
Yeah, I mean, before I even talk about what's going on now, I have to talk about how it was. Zeena and I pretty much came up in the same scene, more or less. I'm a little bit older than her, I believe. But
yeah, you are.
But the hardcore scene I came up in, it was interesting because I was a fan of metal, Metallica and Machine Head and Megadeth and all these bands, but I didn't see those people. The environment I grew up in was an urban environment, and hip hop culture permeated everything. And so when I discovered the hardcore scene, and even though it was all these super heavy kind of metalcore bands, it was also bands like E-Town Concrete or bands like Biohazard, where the music was heavy and the music had a lot of metal in it, but stylistically and lifestyle wise, everything seemed to be permeated by hip hop. And the connection to today is that metal has kind of gravitated more towards an older audience, where hip hop culture has become pop culture. So it almost, to even be quote unquote relevant by today's standards, you kind of almost have to live in that hip hop world. So it's amazing. It's kind of come full circle, but I don't know. It's hard for me to get around like how I came up where that was just the default setting was to have baggy pants and wearing a basketball jersey. I don't know, Zeena, do you concur with our upbringing?
Oh, Doc, for sure. I knew you were going to bring up Ant Money and E-Town Concrete for sure. Doc's right. It's that hardcore, metalcore time where things kind of had that crossover vibe, but it was very street. It was like everybody's wearing dunks. Everybody's wearing jerseys. Everybody's like ready to get in a fight. Everybody's ready for like a throwdown. I think that there's a lot of crossover. Somebody said to me once, I think it was Rob Pasabani from Metal Injection. He said, "Of course you love hardcore." He's like, "It's the hip hop of metal." New York hardcore and that whole punk rock and the early hip hop scene was all kind of built on this like street culture rebellious spirit. And I mean, obviously it flowed over to New Jersey. We get the secondary bits of it. Bands like Madball, Cro-Mags, like all of these New York hardcore bands really helped to kind of make that street style. And to me, that was like the really early stuff, right? And then it kind of spilled over into a bit of the New Jersey stuff that we're talking about in the metalcore scene, but also like in between, like Katy said, nu metal, which was the ultimate rap metal kind of mix. And that took on a whole other life of its own. What do you guys remember of the nu metal times? The good nu metal times?
I love talking about nu metal because, I've talked about this once before in a prior episode that we did with Morgan Lander of Kitty. And we were talking about nu metal. And to me, I felt a lot of these bands kind of were just lumped. Like they just didn't know what to do with all of these emerging bands that were taking these various influences from hip hop and electronic music and rap and funk. And they didn't really like quite know what to do with it. And they just named it all nu metal. And I think it's a weird sticky web because I feel, maybe Korn and Linkin Park, they're clearly related, but are they the same genre? No, I don't really believe they are. A lot of these bands, I think, came out at this time and people took them as a joke and were like, yeah, Korn, they're whack, get them out of here. Linkin Park, whatever. And people were angry because what do metalheads hate more than hip hop? Mainstream. And that was like just the epitome of everything they hated, hearing Linkin Park and Korn and Slipknot every time you turn on the radio or look at MTV or TRL and stuff like that. But I think what's interesting is you look at these bands and they hold up a lot more. And these albums hold up, like the first 4 to 5 Korn albums still hold up today. Linkin Park's first 2 albums still hold up today. Slipknot, their whole discography holds up. So I think it's interesting that people really hated these bands and thought it was a fad and it wasn't going to go anywhere. But really, all these bands exploded all of these bands wrote timeless music, and all of these bands are not just still celebrated today, but they're now the core influence of a lot of what we're seeing come up now.
Yeah, I think that stuff took a long time to actually permeate because it was a kind of a one-way street. By the way, I can't believe we talked about this. We haven't even mentioned Limp Bizkit yet.
Woo!
but
We're avoiding that.
Red D.
Not me. I'm a big fan. So I think that my issue with a lot of connecting new metal to like the real hip hop world, I don't think it was a one-way street in that metal fans or rock fans, I think, were enjoying this kind of infusion of hip hop into rock. But it wasn't like, I don't really think a lot of people who were just straight hip hop heads were all of a sudden like, oh, now I'm gonna get a Korn record. I don't think it really only worked that one way. I think now you're seeing that where people are into hip hop, they'll wear a Slipknot shirt, or Linkin Park has had this great influence on bands like Bring Me the Horizon and things like that. It's really interesting to kind of look at in that context, because I always felt like with new metal, it never, with only a handful of bands, outside of a handful of bands, it always felt like it wasn't authentically hip hop. And so it always had that little, you kind of looking at the side of your face, like, come on, is this really what's up? But I don't know. Zeena, do you agree with me there?
I'm appalled at you, Doc. No, I would say actually I completely disagree.
Okay.
Because I remember during that time, going to school in the hood, kind of like just being with more people who like did not listen to rock music at all, because it was not actually to them something that they would go out of their way to do. A lot of hip hop heads actually were very into Korn, very into Limp Bizkit. And you got to remember during that time too, MTV changed the game, because TRL and all these different avenues where people who listened to hip hop were for the first time ever being kind of forced to watch some of this stuff, right? They had never like went out of their way to see some of this media. I don't know. I don't think it's so much a one-way street. Think about my first concert, I think was like my big concert was Family Values 98. And I think the lineup was like Korn, Limp Bizkit, Ice Cube, and like Rammstein, Katie's favorite.
I know. Honestly, like that sounds like an incredible lineup. And Korn, again, talking about Korn and Ice Cube, another early example of these two genres merging together, because they did a song together on Follow the Leader. So there is a lot of this, you're right there. I think there is something to say there about how hip hop actually really did embrace metal just as much as metal embraced hip hop.
And Doc, your boy, Ice-T.
Yeah, but it's so funny because when I listen to Body Count, I don't think about hip hop. Like, to me, Body Count sounds like a hardcore band. Mm-hmm. And even though he'll do rhythmic things, it's akin to rapping. But for some reason, I almost separate Ice-T the rapper and Ice-T and Body Count. So I wrote a song on a Body Count record a couple records ago, a song called This Is Why We Ride. And I remember writing it, not really sure what he would do, and he put some pure flow on it. I was like, oh my God, that's why Ice-T is the king. He just had that rhythmic pocket with it. It was really amazing. I think I'm going to talk about that era, right? Like the Body Count and previous, like going into the late 80s, into the 90s, it seemed like there was actually an affinity between metal and hip hop, because they were both considered to be like dangerous, right? This is when the whole PMRC, right? They wanted to put labels on stuff. And it was this idea that these styles of music, right? You put on a Guns N' Roses record, you put on an NWA record, they're talking about sex, they're talking about violence, they're talking, these were controversial, dangerous figures. And I think it really made it feel like connected, even though sonically it sounded different. Like I remember seeing Axl Rose wear like an NWA hat, or like when Slayer, it's like, to me, it's no coincidence that Rick Rubin is kind of the direct line between Run DMC and Beastie Boys and Slayer, because it almost comes from the same mentality. Those, like, there's an extreme thing, and that obviously changed over the years because hip hop became more pop. It lost that kind of dangerous edge of the the gangster rap era, and maybe even metal to a certain degree, maybe lost its edge a little bit. I don't know.
I agree completely. Like, Public Enemy, Anthrax, like kind of like that screw the system type vibe where it's really kind of counterculture a bit. And you're right. I think that the censorship had a lot to do with that because it was really different genres coming together for one common cause, which obviously kind of just created a completely different like level of camaraderie for sure.
No love for Linkin Park. Damn.
Because to me, Linkin Park is not, when I listen to Linkin Park, I don't really hear hip hop. I hear like this, they almost invented a new genre, right? It's like rock and pop, but the hip hop is very kind of that smooth backpacker style. Like it wasn't hard, it wasn't grimy, it wasn't dangerous in that way. And by the way, and I'm not trying to diss Mike Shinoda because I think he really is a good MC. It just felt like they were like this band of the world, that it just felt a little different. And it almost the same thing with Limp Bizkit, because even though he was rapping, like could you imagine Fred Durst just doing a pure hip hop album? Would people like that?
And Linkin Park kind of did something that I think was a gold standard at the time, doing the collab with Jay-Z, which at the time people had done like one-off songs, but never done a complete body of work, right? What do you guys think of that?
Well, I hated it when it first came out. I was like really upset with it because I think it's kind of interesting when you look back and when you're young and you're ignorant and you're just kind of finding your feet in something new. And ironically, when you look back and you see that I was probably a fan and, still am a fan of, at the time, one of the most unaccepted genres, metalheads were not accepting that genre. Like it wasn't true or whatever. I, at the same time, was like, oh, I acted like, I wasn't listening to rap like a year earlier. Like, I'm like, oh no, how dare they do this with Jay-Z? This is, I don't know. I just felt metal should be pure, which again is so stupid and so ironic when you just look back at what I was listening to at the time. But I was like 12 years old. I don't know what's really going on, but looking back, that's incredible. It's an absolutely incredible collaboration. And just like you said, Zeena, it was super like monumental. That was, again, just another staple in the story of this genre's history and evolution. So, and I love it. That's the kind of jam that like when that comes on, I'm like cranking that. I'm getting hype. Like I'm stoked. That still is said to be true. Like exactly what I just said, where I'm like, I'm going to listen to Ghost Main. What is this? And then I did. I'm like, why haven't I been listening to this whole time?
Doc, is it your jam?
I didn't really get into it that much, but I think in many ways, sometimes the apex of a genre, it also can be its death knell, because that to me was like the pinnacle of a certain type of pop culture where in a sense Jay-Z is bigger than hip hop and Linkin Park was bigger than rock, right? There was just this thing that kind of existed outside of it. But I think it's great. I mean, but if you look around that time, right, if you were a nu metal band that had a rapper, you were kind of persona non grata. Like you were on the way out. You couldn't get a record deal. People thought you were shot. People thought you were passé. So it was a reflection that the mainstream, at least, that was like the pinnacle, and it was kind of over for a while until you fast forward going into the 2010s. That generation of people, this was the generation that grew up on hip hop. They grew up on nu metal. So they were a complete reflection of that. And to me, it's just like now a lot of those questions of like, oh, is it rap? Is it rock? Now it's a little, everything's kind of on board, right? You're kind of like, we're kind of okay with everything right now, which I think is a very good and healthy place to be. The only thing we need to do is get the closed-minded people in rock and metal who just want to keep it quote unquote pure, or kind of, we need to get them to shut up. And because that's, to me, the only way we're going to keep young people into rock is by letting know like the youth is where hip hop's at. That's just where they're at. So how can you, and it's people like the Post Malones and the MGKs that may be rock's best savior. I've said this on the show before, but it bears repeating again.
Oh, I feel the same way. Yeah, like it was like probably one of the first times all three of us are on the same page. But like even when Miley Cyrus said she's going to put out like a Metallica covers album, everyone lost their minds. Like it was like some kind of inhumane blasphemy. And I was like, this is great, because now kids who were about the age I was when, I first discovered Metallica are now going to discover it too. Getting these artists that are hip now with the younger audience, ones that are trending, that are mainstream, that are household names, and getting them to slowly introduce it and feed it to people. Metal is not a healthy genre. And like, it's kind of really getting frustrating with all these metalheads be like, oh, I'm so mad that someone's helping keep this genre alive. Like, if they're not doing it, who's gonna? Like, if Post Malone's not out there and Miley Cyrus isn't out there and like championing for us, if Kanye West isn't wearing a suicidal tendencies like jacket, who's gonna do it? Who's carrying the torch?
I think that we all have learned on this episode that there is a wonderful place in the future for hip hop, for metal, to all live in one. And actually the future is now. It's already happening. So yeah, this has been a great key learning for all of us. Katy, where can people find you?
On Twitter and Instagram at Merciful Kate.
Doctor, tell us where.
You can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Coyle, or go to my website, www.coyle.net.
And as always, you can find me at Zeena Koda wherever the internet exists, because I got a monopoly on that B. If you want to hear all of our rap rock selections and where you can get your Demonia platform boots, you can check out the full podcast wherever you get your podcasts.